So welcome back to the qualitative part of this webinar. As you can see, I'm following the same process as Henny to explain the qualitative proposal process as well. So the first thing with regards to the research process that we need to consider is the problem inquiry. So the questions the research proposal must answer are, for instance, why would anyone be interested in my research? Is the research design, for instance, credible, achievable, and carefully explained? In other words, is your proposal following a logical view? And as well, is the researcher capable of doing this research? These are things that you constantly need to consider when planning the proposal phase of your qualitative proposal. So a research proposal is like a blueprint of a building plan. Before any construction can even start, we would need to look at the appropriateness of aligning the planning with regards to this process. And that is the same, for instance, with a qualitative research proposal or quantitative as well. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail in the end. So the things that we are going to need to consider, for instance, is step one, the problem inquiry. So qualitative approach to research is based on the worldview, for instance. This worldview of the participants is usually a holistic approach, and they have certain beliefs that they engage within. So we need to constantly think about, or we need to consider within a qualitative approach, that there is no single reality. We also need to think about that these realities are constructed based on perceptions of different people based on change over time, for instance. So we know that realities are constructed based on a perception that a person is identified with. So usually what we know has meaning only within a given context or situation. So what we need to do is we need to think about what are the research aims, what are the objectives, and what are the research questions before even considering the title of your proposal. So research aim, I'm just quickly going through the definition of it. So research aim is a statement indicating the general aim or purpose of the research project. Research objectives are usually specific statements that indicate the key issues, the focus of the research project. And we have the research questions. This can also closely relate, for instance, to your research aims and objectives. So research questions can be an alternative to your research questions can be an alternative to your research objectives, where the key issue is to be focused on the research project in a stated form of questions. So what does this mean, basically? Researchers needs a clear picture of the issues and questions that they want to investigate. They need to think about what are the ideas and how am I going to approach these ideas when I'm investigating a certain concept, for instance. So the first thing that you need to consider is, for instance, the title. When you consider your title, you might start off with a simple title. It should be very important to know that your title might even change. Or for instance, if you do not have a title yet, or you're not really able to identify what your completed title should look like, I would then suggest looking at the research question, aims, and objective. Within this process, we need to constantly think about how can we, for instance, take the concepts or the ideas of these participants and make sure that we are focusing on these concepts and concerns that we want to investigate. So the title only gives the name to the research, and it also means to kind of identify what the contribution of the researcher is. Within a qualitative perspective, it should be noted that the research instrument is regarded that the researcher is part of this process. The researcher is regarded as part as the research instrument with regards to a qualitative study. So you need to think, for instance, does my title summarize, for instance, what I would like to investigate? And like I've mentioned, if it does not yet, you would clearly be able to identify what this title attributes by identifying your research questions. So the research questions focus on identifying the what. It questions whether, for instance, the what, the how, and in what ways within your study, what you are looking at. So with regards to the research question, the first things that you need to, or the few things that you need to ask yourself is, for instance, what are we trying to examine? What can we learn from this research? What is the purpose of this research? And all of this will help you in order to identify, for instance, what your research problem is and the background within the study. So we need to think about what information is needed to answer this research question as well. So when you pose a research question, you are going to need to think about what do I need in order for this research question to be answered as well. So the initial questions can be conceptualized as generative questions, for instance. They might invite people to a series of specific questions furtherly. So you can start off by, for instance, identifying general research questions. Once you have identified these general research questions, you would also be able to, for instance, identify sub-research questions. These sub-research questions would usually, for instance, be closely related to your aims and objectives. So with regards to your aims and objectives usually need to be clear, concise, and declarative statements. It provides the direction of the study. If you are going to, for instance, explore perceptions within a certain context, your aims and objectives are clearly going to outline how you are going to explore this. What are you going to explore this? Why are you exploring this? So again, if you create your research questions, you need to think about relating your aims and objectives to these questions as well. So having decided what to study, for instance, which is your research topic, and knowing why you want to study this, which relates to your problem statement and your research question, you would be able to formulate the study objectives. So formulating a research aim and objectives is the appropriate manner, for instance, to look at the important aspects within your thesis. What is the focus of this thesis, for example? The research question is the central question, whereby the research aim provides an answer to these questions. So this is the process that you would need to, for example, follow. So with regards to your research questions, you would need to think about what type of research questions am I addressing? So we have descriptive, interpretive, and theoretical research questions. Descriptive research questions ask about what actually is happening within that process. It's kind of to see what currently does that person or that participant interpret the context that you have asked them about. You want to know more, you want to inquire. But we also get interpretive research questions. Interpretive research questions is where we want to ask the meaning about what happened. We want to know why things have happened. Usually with regards to an interview as well, if you have certain interpretive research questions, you would be furtherly able to investigate this by, for instance, probing the participants, by making sure that you understand with regards to that context, what needs to be interpreted. And the only way that you know what needs to be interpreted is to look at, for instance, what the literature has shown, what the theory has shown, which leads to a theoretical question. If you, within your study, have, for instance, identified that I have a set theory that I need to address, you would need to look at how, within your aims and your research questions, are you addressing these theoretical research questions about? So your research questions should focus on, for instance, exploring effects, understanding certain issues, gathering participants' perceptions, and also having open and flexible responses. We are not trying to prove anything. We are not measuring. And there's no strong hypothesis with regards to research questions in a qualitative study. Obviously, if you are conducting a mixed method study, you are going to have research questions for the qualitative part of the study, and you're going to identify the research questions and hypotheses within the quantitative part of the study. So here are some sample questions. So with regard to the sample questions, the thing that I would like you to closely see is, for instance, the way the wording has placed. The moment when we reach out with regards to qualitative questions, it also relates to the paradigm, for instance, of your study. If you are doing an interpretive phenomenological approach, which I'm not going to discuss, paradigms today, but for instance, if you are doing a phenomenological approach, we know that the concentration is by looking at the experiences of people, by looking at the perceptions of people. So make sure that when you do write your research questions down, that you're addressing, for instance, your aim of this research as well. If you're looking at the shared experience, it needs to be evident in your sample, in your questions. If you're looking at the perceptions of certain people, it needs to be evident in your research question. And make sure that your research questions are precise. It should not be too vague. For example, if we take the first example, what are the shared experiences of female fans of Major League Baseball? You can see it is quite precise. What are the shared experiences of female fans would have not been the correct way, because it's still lacking the information that was relevant with regards to the focus of this research study. I also see there's a question, for instance, if you ask, do you need both research questions objectives, or would you just have, for instance, the research questions, aims, and objectives? It is recommended to have, for instance, research questions. It is then recommended to have a main research aim. In order to identify how we would be furtherly able to investigate this research aim, for example, we would have set objectives. So in the end, yes, you are going to have, for instance, research questions. You are going to have aims, you're going to have a main aim, and your objectives are going to closely relate to as to how to answer the main aim that you have identified. So a research aim will usually be followed by a series of statements describing a project's research objectives. It is clearly defined and it directs the research into the direction as to what they are going to study. A crucial task in any research project is defining the core objectives or defining the core questions. What is the central goal? What is the main purpose that you are trying to achieve? And with regards to objectives, you would then be able to note how you would be able to answer these questions. So without a clear objective, a researcher is aimless and directionless in conducting the study. So if you're not sure how to address your aims and objectives, be smart about it. And when I say be smart about it, use these acronyms to kind of see what are the specifics within your study? What are the specific aims and objectives? If you have identified these, you would need to look at whether it's measurable. How would you be able to measure this? If I am able to measure this, in what way can we measure this? So for instance, if our aim is to see what our perceptions are within the COVID pandemic, that would be a specific. How would it be measurable? We would see, okay, cool, we would be able to identify this aspect by measuring it through interviews, but not just identifying the measurable fact as to saying it's interviews, but furtherly investigating it as to kind of note down what are the specific questions that I need to ask to make this concept measurable. And then you would need to see, is this attainable? If I have the specific goals and I've seen the way I can measure it, in the end, am I going to attain the certain specific results that I am looking at? Is it attainable? Also, you need to ask yourself, is this relevant? So many times would we, for instance, identify a research topic, and then we would start, for instance, by just identifying random things. You need to make sure these random things that you are identifying, is it relevant towards the focus of your study? And then lastly, think about the time. We all know we have a certain stage to conduct the proposal. We have a certain stage or time frame to conduct the dissertation. Make sure you have set out a timeline so that when you do not achieve certain goals, so that you can rework it. And in this way, you would be able to, for instance, be able to identify what your specific aims are. And within this specific aim, what objectives would I be able to identify to answer this specific aim? So for instance, again, just to note down, specific relates to what will the goal accomplish, how will it and why will it, and who is the target population. These are things that you need to consider. If you have a target population based, for instance, on children, you would need to think about how do I measure it? If I measure children, it means that I would need to look at the Child's Act, where I need to get assent and consent. I would also need to think about how am I going to measure this? Is there anything that would change within my participants? For instance, to note down within my own study, I followed a certain program. It was measurable. A thing that I did not consider was whether the program would change. So I got people from my sample, or I sampled people with interviews, and this program changed, and it hindered me to continue collecting participants in this process. So it's something that you need to consider. Are there anything when I am measuring this goal that might, for instance, not make it attainable? Again, attainable. Is it achievable? Is it possible? Is it relevant? Is your goal meaningful? Am I actually adding to the body of knowledge with my topic? Or has it already been over-researched? So the relevant would say, for instance, so what? So what are we measuring? And again, like I've mentioned, the time should also be considered. We also have, for instance, a literature study in step 2. It's also very important to note that within your literature study, that this might add to, for instance, your chapter 2 as well, where you need to conduct this literature study furtherly. So literature review is never just a list of studies. It always offers an argument about the body of the research. Within a literature review, usually you have your introduction. Within the introduction, you need to kind of identify what is my thesis statement, what is my stance, what is the point that I'm trying to convey with this literature study or with this proposal, for instance. So the literature review is a critical look at the existing research that is significant to the work that you are carrying out. With regards to a literature study, you would first kind of identify a skeleton. What are the things that I feel important? What is my focus? What are the concepts that I feel is important with regards to my literature? And also, you would need to look at, for instance, if you need to incorporate a certain theory, and if you are doing a PhD, it is important to note that this is a compulsory step, but you would need to have a theoretical point of view to support your research. In order to identify a theory that will suit with yours, with your aim of your study, you would need to look at what other people did. Maybe see what other researchers and authors did, so that you would also be able to identify a theory in the same area that you are studying. Something small just to note as well. If you are conducting a literature review and you have identified, obviously everybody's conducting a literature review, but once you have conducted your literature review and you have identified, for instance, what your theoretical stance is to support your claims, you would need to note that these theories that you identify needs to be evident in your research interview schedule as well. When you are asking questions, for instance, with your participants, you need to note that with regards to the theory, how can I ask these questions so that my theory is also evident within the interviews? A lot of people forget to bring in their interviews within the interview schedule. Moving over to the research methodology, we also have the research design. So there are numerous research designs to the qualitative approach. And all of them are characterized, for instance, for looking at what questions about realities are we asking? What is the understanding? You also need to look at, for instance, how the data is expressed. The focus of this workshop is only to kind of introduce focus groups or to focus on focus groups and interviews. But if you are doing a document analysis, you would need to note what are the things that I'm focusing on within this document. You also need to think about, for instance, what are the main instruments that I'm going to use within this approach? And your instrument will be guided by your research design. So we have different types of research designs. I've just placed 4 of the most prominent ones that I have identified as being used quite a few times. First being phenomenology in the left-hand corner. Phenomenology examines human experiences. We try to explore and describe what the lived experiences of that person is with regards to the topic that you are investigating. Experiences can include things such as thinking about your research question, what words are you going to need to use? Such as perceptions. If you want to see the perceptions of individuals, you would need to note it in a research question, or objectives. You can also kind of investigate the beliefs, the feelings, decisions, and, for instance, experiences. Once you kind of attribute to these types of experiences, you would know that you are kind of identifying within a phenomenological study. With regards to phenomenological study, usually we would use in-depth interviews. You can, if you want to, also use diaries and journals, but like I've mentioned, the focus here is just kind of providing interviews and focus group. You can also engage with case studies. This is usually where we kind of would like to study a single instance of a certain event. So if you would like to see what is the throughput rate of a certain student class within a certain context of the university or a certain program, that would mean that you are studying a certain case, for example. Usually we would use multiple sources. For instance, you would use data such as throughput rate. If you wanted to look at the throughput rate, you would have needed to look at, for instance, what currently within that environment, what is the current data available. If it's only quantitative data that is available, your case study is not going to be as a qualitative nature. So you'd need to see, are there any, for instance, programs that I can compare with one another? Are there any activities that we can do with the students to kind of compare these with one another as well? And when I say activities, these activities would need to lead to qualitative perceptions. So this would be, for instance, interviews, observation notes, diaries, documents. It can go on and on. So case selection strategies usually relates to critical cases, extreme cases, or for instance, looking at a representative case. We also have the concept of ethnography. Ethnography is the process and product of describing and interpreting the behavior of a distinct culture. Within this process, the researcher places themselves within the context. They become part of the process. They would be able to kind of interpret certain distinct cultural values. They would be able to interpret certain behaviors within that cultural setting, while at the same time being part of this community or, for instance, culture. We also have the concept of grounded theory. So grounded theory is used to kind of develop a theoretical account. It's to kind of see how we can build a theory based on the lived experiences of participants. We would also use, for instance, interviews, focus groups, observations, and field notes within grounded theory. Also very important to note that within all of these processes, there are certain aims and objectives that you also need to kind of look at so that they are related to your topic of choice. So with regard to data collection, with qualitative, we also have the process of purposive sampling or snowball sampling. We use purposive sampling based, for instance, that we have a set idea as to who we are going to interview. These people that we are interviewing needs to set, for instance, or needs to have the qualities based on what our purpose of this interview is. So there are some guiding principles that we can look at, for instance. One is being the appropriateness. You would need to look at, for instance, whether the people that you are sampling, whether the participants that you are sampling are appropriate to the research question. If you are going to look at, for instance, supervisors within the academic space of psychology realm, you would only need to focus you only need to focus on guiding, or you only need to focus on attaining these participants by looking at people that are within the psychology sector, that are supervisors. There's a certain appropriateness, there's a certain aim that you are trying to investigate. We also look at, for instance, advocacy. Is there enough data to provide a rich description of this phenomenon? I cannot really, for instance, tell you that with regards to qualitative, you need to have 10 interviews, you need to have 20 interviews. We cannot say that. It's all based on your research aim. It's all based on your research question. I can tell you that, for instance, based on Creswell, that it's mentioned to always have more than 6. But if you think about it, having 6, does it really represent your, for instance, idea that you are trying to get across? Which relates to our sample size. If you want to see, for instance, with regards to a qualitative interview, if you have collected or have attained enough interviews, you would start with the analysis. I know nobody almost follows this process, but to see if your, for instance, data has reached saturation, you would need to kind of do interviews, start with 3 or 4 interviews, start analyzing your interviews and already see where have I lacked information. You would then get new participants and ask them questions based on this revised interview that you have created now. Because you have identified that within your sample that you have certain gaps. I know this is not, for instance, a process that is feasible with regards to the university's timelines. So what I would suggest is discussing this with your supervisor. Most of the times it has been noted that 10 participants are used, 10 to 30 participants. Rarely have we used more than 30. But again, it all depends on your aim. I would like to, for instance, look at if I have a certain perception based on investigating leaders, investigating students, and investigating peers, for instance, stupid example. I would need to kind of be able to identify, to interview at least 3 to 5 people in each category. So if you have different categories within your qualitative research proposal, for instance, if you want to sample or interview different people, you would be able to look at, for instance, how would I be able to make that these categorizations are represented in my qualitative interviews. Doing one interview with one person in one categorization is not enough because you are just bringing the perceived ideas of one participant. So with regards to the probability sampling strategy, we engage with purposive, snowball, quota, and theoretical. All depends again on your aim that you have identified. So there are 3 ways of collecting qualitative data. One of them would be listening to your informants. When I say listening to informants, it means that we most probably are going to conduct a method such as interviews or focus groups. We can also engage with observations and observing. When you are engaging with observations, you would need to know what are the observations that I'm looking at. And you can, for instance, examine materials as well. You can, for instance, engage with a literature study where you would do a systematic review, which is where you would only examine, for instance, the relevance of a few articles. All of these methods, again, would relate to the way that you are conducting this qualitative research process. Based on our perception, interviews and focus groups are mostly used within a qualitative research process. We also have the research instrument. So like I've mentioned, for instance, the researcher forms part of the research instrument. The reason why? With qualitative research, we do not have an objective stance like, for instance, in quantitative. We have a subjective stance as, for instance, we are the people conducting these interviews. We know, for instance, what is the focus of this research. And we need to conduct these interviews with this person by keeping in mind, what are my research aims? So one-on-one research techniques in which a respondent answers a research question is known as an interview. So you sit with a person, you conduct an interview based on a certain framework that you have created. We are not just going to ask, for instance, interview questions or random questions to all the participants. No, we are going to have a set framework where you need to identify, these are the concepts that I'm looking at. These concepts need to be evident in my interview structure, which leads us to the structure that you need to identify. So for instance, the structure would relate to, if you have chosen a structured interview, it means that you would have close-ended questions. It means that these questions usually has a predetermined response option, and it's usually mainly quantitative data. It's very limited with regards to using it in qualitative research. You also need to think about, for instance, semi-structured. This is the type of interview process that we mostly use to conduct research. We have open-ended questions. Usually you'll have 10 to 12 questions. Or you'll have 5 major questions, and within these 5 major questions, you'll have certain probes as to note down what are the concepts that I need to discuss. We also have unstructured. This is where you also, for instance, use open-ended questions, and this causes a discussion. This is your aim. This is what you would like to, for instance, aim in identifying with an interview. You would like to, for instance, reflect. What is this participant saying? Can I reflect as to kind of clearly understanding what this participant is saying, if you do not understand it clearly? Or is this participant maybe discussing any points that are prominent? Would you like this participant to communicate this? So that in the end, you'll have a discussion-based interview. So with regards to the interview skeleton, the first thing that we need to kind of identify is the opening. Whenever you start with an interview, you start with an opening. When you start with the opening, you start by welcoming the participant. You would like the participant to feel relaxed. It might not feel this, as a researcher, you might not feel that the participant, for instance, is stressed or they feel a bit uncomfortableness as they are not really sure what's going to happen in this interview. So by creating an opening with the interview, you are creating a discussion so that the participant can build some rapport with you. And how do we build rapport with the participant? We start discussing the ethics with them. We tell them, this is voluntary. At no time do you need to or are you forced to partake in this study. Your responses would be anonymous. All of these things you need to relate to, for instance, your participant. You can also, within the introduction or the opening, note down that, for instance, these are the aims and objectives that we are trying to investigate within this qualitative study. And then also tell them what is the expected length. This interview might take 40 to 50 minutes. Please help me to furtherly investigate this topic by bringing in your experiences. And therefore, we would then kind of start with the body. Within the body, you would need to list topics that needs to be covered. You would identify the potential questions that you are going to ask. However, we need to note that although we are already identifying the potential questions and the structure, that this schedule would still allow freedom for you to kind of probe this participant. Probing means that you are asking them a certain question about a certain thing that you are investigating. So furtherly communicating with you about what you are trying to investigate. And before, don't just end your interview prematurely, but end off with a closing. Summarize the main idea that you have looked at. Tell the participant what the next course of action would be. For instance, are your results going to be publicized? Are you only going to start with your dissertation now? And lastly, thank the participant as well. So just to kind of give you an idea what the opening should look like. If we look at, for instance, if we start with an interview, the first thing that we are going to start with is to establishing the report. We would introduce ourselves and also chat to the interviewee, for instance, as to what they can expect, which leads to the purpose. What are you going to, for instance, ask this participant? What are the aims and objectives? And if you can, also provide motivation, for instance. How would you use this information? Give motivation as to why the participant's response is so important. And also look at the timeline. If the interview is going to take 50 minutes, try to keep by 15 minutes, for instance. Once you are done with the opening, have a little transition question. Let me begin by asking you some questions about where you and your family live. And then, for instance, you might be able to furtherly investigate. The main thing that I want you guys to kind of identify within the body, for example, is here at the top where it says B, topic education. It means that this is all of the questions related to the aim that you are investigating. This person is thoroughly investigating things within the education realm. Make sure that you identify all your concepts that you are going to discuss. And then only would you transition into your closing phase. Summarize what you have identified, your main aim, note down or thank your participant, and then also note what action is going to be taken. Are you going to use this information in the article? If the participant has any more questions, for example. And that is how you would create an interview schedule. So with regards to the interview schedule, you would also need to look at a focus group. If you are conducting focus group, you would need to create an interview schedule as well. However, with a focus group, participants are not just one anymore. We have 6 to 8 participants, for example. We would sit in a circular motion so that the circular would create more discussion. Again, you would start with a brief overview. You would clearly state the purpose of the interview. You would negotiate ethics. And also important, which I've not mentioned in the previous interview framework, is to record your interview. Make sure you have also, for instance, tested the recording devices to make sure that you do not have any difficulties in the interview process. Make sure you have all of these things set out before the interview. With regards to a focus group, one thing that you are going to need to note down, for instance, is if there is one person or participant in this focus group that is dominating the conversation. The moment when you as the researcher Being the instrument, notice that a member is monopolizing or taking the conversation over. You would need to, for instance, guide this conversation and ask other participants. Thank you, participant B, for your input. Can I hear more from participant C? Participant D, what is your perception based on what participant C just mentioned? And you would create a flow within this focus group. We also have the process of analysis. It's also very important to note down that within your proposal, your analysis might be noted down within your research methodology. But you would also note down that in your dissertation, you would also have a completed chapter just for your analytical viewpoint as well. So with regards to qualitative data analysis, it's important to consider that the data are narrative constructions. It's never the original experiences. Thus, we are always removed from the actual experience and can only bring approximations of the truth. We can only, for instance, say that based on these perceptions, we believe these are the following things. So the principle of analysis is to kind of look at what is the interaction between the data collection and the analysis. You would need to look at, for instance, flexibility. Within the interview, you would have needed to note, for instance, that my participant is not really answering the questions based, or they're not really clearly understanding the questions. How can I, for instance, be flexible to pose this question in another manner so that they are actually addressing the question that you are trying to ask without influencing their answer? So with regard to flexibility, you need to know that with the qualitative process, it's an iterative process. You are constantly going to feel that you are conducting interviews, analyzing, going back to the literature review, seeing what, for instance, your aims and objectives are, and going back to the interview as part of your analysis. It's a flexible process where you constantly need to think about as to what my research aims are. What does the theory say, for example? You also need to be reflexive. With regards to reflexivity, you would need to reflect on what one is doing and what one is thinking about that current situation. If you furtherly read up about the levels of trustworthiness, how to make qualitative more valid and reliable, reflexivity is one of the concepts that you would need to discuss. So we also need to note down that context is important, that within our research, that we can only make certain conclusions based on our specific context. Qualitative never generalizes to a certain population, for example. We never generalize. You would also need to note down, for instance, how you can, for instance, identify your findings and how you would be able to take these findings and support it with the evidence. The evidence would be as to note down what were the verbatim quotes. These interviews that you have gotten, you would be able to take these quotations, part of the interviews as quotes, and this would become, for instance, your evidence in the analytical process. Within this analytical process, when you have these quotations, you would need to check, is there any literature that supported what I have found it? If there's no literature to support what you have found it, is there any literature that contradicts that I have found it? So with regards to qualitative data analysis, the important thing that you need to consider is coding. Coding is the most important process of qualitative analysis. Any researcher who wishes to become proficient at doing qualitative analysis must learn to code well and easily. The excellence of the research rests in large part on the excellence of the coding. So this book by Johnny Saldana is a good book to kind of for you to get when you start with the analytical process, to kind of firstly note what is coding, how do we code, how do I start the coding process, what is the concept of defining codes and where do codes come from. These are things that you would need to, for instance, look at as well. So with regards to qualitative data, we have a few certain steps that need to be followed. I personally like to follow Braun and Clark's steps based on thematic analysis. It's clearly outlined for me. That's why I like to follow that process. But again, you would need to look at, within qualitative, we do have thematic analysis, we have content analysis, we have content thematic analysis, we have interpretive phenomenological analysis. Within grounded theory, there's another type of analysis. But the most important thing to note down, that all of these type of analysis follows the same process as thematic. Thematic is the mother of all processes, for the pure reason that all of these processes would try to kind of identify codes. All of them would identify codes. IPA might, for instance, identify with subcategories and identifying categories. So the language might, the discourse might change, but the aim behind qualitative analysis is trying to find codes and taking these codes and categorizing them thoroughly into themes. All qualitative analysis is based on this process. That is why I'm only going to, for instance, explain thematic analysis to you. So with regards to the first process of qualitative analysis is to immerse yourself with the data. You are going to start by transcribing the data. The moment when you start transcribing the data, you are already going to note down what are my preconceived ideas. You are also going to note down, for instance, can I already identify any codes? You're not going to start with the coding process. You're only going to start, for instance, by noting down your initial ideas. This is how you would immerse yourself with the data, by reading through the transcripts and gaining an overview. Within the immersion phase, some codes and themes might become apparent. But again, like I've mentioned, we do not start with the initial coding process. We only want to kind of see what the preliminary codes are before even starting with it. If you have read through your data once by transcribing it, for instance, and then going through it again by reading it, you would have a keen idea as to what the participants are mentioning, what the participants' perceptions are. And you would note down these ideas. After you've noted down these ideas, then only you would start by beginning the coding process. So with regards to coding, you can start off by open coding. This is usually an inductive form of coding, where we kind of just look at what the meaning of the participants is representing us. So you would start by selecting as part a quote that was mentioned within the interview, and you would take that quote and code it appropriately as to note down how does this quotation relate to the research aims and objectives of my study. Within a qualitative process, you are constantly going to think about what are my research aims and objectives, because you have a certain focus. You're not just going to start coding by just thumb sucking and saying, well, I think this is major contributions and this is this, because that's not how it works. Again, when you code, you're going to think about what this participant has said. Can I relate it to, for instance, answering any of my research questions? Can I take what this participant has mentioned and relate it to any, for instance, theory that I've identified in my literature review? And in that way, you are constantly thinking about what is my theory? What are my aims? What are my objectives? Because these are the things that kind of guide you in your coding process. After you have coded everything, then only would you begin with categorizations. So what you would do then is kind of note down all of these codes that I have created. How can I combine some of these codes to create a certain construct or a certain concept? How can I categorize my data furtherly? Usually with regards to creating this next categorization, which usually would be, for instance, your themes. It depends on how many levels of coding you have. You can have 2 levels of coding, where you only identify codes and themes, for instance. Or you can have 3 levels of coding, where you have codes. These codes are then categorized in a categorization. And these categories are then only categorized into certain themes. And that would be a 3rd level of, for instance, coding. So again, make sure what process you are following. If you have large data sets, if you have conducted, for instance, 30 interviews, the chances of you having 3 levels of coding is quite prominent, because it categorizes the data. It sorts your data to create a story that you are trying to convey to the reader of your dissertation. So again, with regards to your categorization and themes, you would allow your theoretical framework to guide you into labeling these categorizations. What have identified in the literature? What did other authors mention that was quite prominent about these factors that I have discussed? And again, if your theoretical framework is in line with your interview schedule, your coding is going to be easier. If you have already within your interview schedule kind of identified what the concepts are that you are focusing on, it's going to be easier to, in the end, code your data. So if you're furtherly categorizing your categories into themes, you would then engage into step 5, where we would use themes to see the whole picture. Here, the key questions can guide you, for instance. What are the relationships between these categories? What do these categories mean when they are together? Because we want to see if you are creating a construct, how is it defined? In order to see how it is defined, you would need to note down what the codes and categories are within. And if you have noted the codes and categories, you would need to state, how did I, for instance, create these codes and categories to form this theme or to form this idea or story that I'm trying to convey? And after, once you have created your themes, all of your categories have been created and all of your codes are categorized under these categories, then you would start by formulating the argument. And this also relates back to the last step of the write-up. The purpose into formulating an argument is to present each theme in a reasoned point as to note down how did they relate to the conclusion. When I say conclusion, again, how does this theme answer any of my objectives? I would be able to formulate this argument by looking at, for instance, how the evidence is integrated in the argument. How have I taken my codes and made sure that it is in line with the theory that I've identified and with the literature in my literature review? There should be a merger between literature, which is your theory, and your data, which is the interview quotations. If there's no link, it means somewhere in your research aims and objectives, you were not clear enough. So getting to the last slide before we end off this presentation. So like Henny has created the quantitative matrix, I have taken this matrix and created a qualitative matrix to make the process for you a bit clearer as well. So with regards to this matrix, the first thing that you are going to identify is the literature review. Underneath this concept, we want to see, for instance, within the literature, what were the concepts that they have identified? What are the main objectives that you are looking at, for instance? You would then identify a research question or objective, depending on your process that you like. I like to use objectives. But you would then be able to identify what research objective am I investigating currently. You would then be able to note down any qualitative interview questions. What are the questions that I would like to ask, for instance, based on this theory that we are looking at? You would also be able to note down, with regards to this qualitative research question, what is the variable or the construct that we are looking at? Because in the end, these variables or constructs might become your themes. We would also be able to kind of furtherly see, are there variables that define the construct? So these variables that you identify here, these can become, for instance, codes that you have identified, preliminary codes. And in the end, you would also be able to note down what analytical process are you going to note. So again, with regards to this process, you are taking the aim that you are trying to investigate, and you are splitting it up as to note down, what does the literature say? Within my study, what are the interview questions that I can create to kind of investigate this concept? What are the main variable or constructs? Sometimes these main qualitative variables and constructs would directly relate to your research objectives. And what are the codes that we can, for instance, identify that kind of defines this construct that we have identified previously? And if you follow this process, you would clearly be able to plan your research proposal, and in the end, also, for instance, identify the research questions that you need to ask and how these research questions are, for instance, in line with your aims and objective. How can I ask my qualitative interview questions? Well, I'm going to ask these 5 questions because I know the literature review is one of the focus that we have. My focus would then, for instance, be, what is the research objective? How can I answer this research objective? By looking at the qualitative interviews that we are going to ask. These qualitative interviews are closely going to, for instance, relate to this theme. And within the qualitative interviews, we are going to see whether the participant is actually discussing these constructs that we have identified. And if you follow that process, you would then, in the end, avoid any mishaps in your qualitative process. And that is it for the qualitative proposal. So, really, should I just go through the questions? I'm not sure how many questions are there.
Monique, hello?
Yes.
Yes, there's a lot of people that ask about the slides. Maybe we must try to put it on the website, on the blog or on Facebook. And then we can just go through the questions. There was a few from Clarissa, and there's not much. Let me just go to. Okay, if you can have a look.
I'd just like to see which, do you know perhaps where the questions start?
Yeah, let me just go.
People
asked about the slides. Okay, the first one was Clarissa asked about, do we need research questions and objectives, or do you work with other research questions and objectives?
Okay, cool. So obviously research aims would be your main perspective that you are investigating. In order to kind of see how we are furtherly going to investigate this aim, we are going to identify the objectives. So the objectives would be precisely noted as to how you are going to answer the aim, for instance. So yes, you would engage with all 3 processes. Sorry, and I'm just trying to find that question to see.
It's from Clarissa.
Yeah, I see. I see Elizabeth has noted that paradigms are essential to discuss. I have to agree with you, Elizabeth. Paradigms are crucial. It kind of gives the perspective as to what you are following. If you are following a post-positivistic approach, you need to see what is the discourses behind it. If you are following an interpretive phenomenological approach, you need to see, for instance, the discourses behind it and the aims. However, unfortunately, we could not have discussed this as time was time was against us. See, Norman, how do you measure the constructs in qualitative research design? So with regards to qualitative research design, we would measure it through thematic analysis. But again, you would probably first identify these constructs based on the literature that you have reviewed or the theoretical component that you have identified. So again, your research aims and objective plays an important part in qualitative as it guides the process as to what we would like to investigate, for instance. Also remember, Norman, that qualitative is a subjective approach. We only would note down how we would, for instance, make sure within the research processes, what things that we do to avoid that our subjectivity influence the research. So for instance, we would make sure that we have a reflexive view. We would constantly reflect as to what might preconceived ideas are, what are the ideas that the participant is conveying you, and you would actually note this in a qualitative research. So as you are doing interviews, note down what you are feeling as well. Can you kindly share the PowerPoint presentations? Yes, we will. Can I present? Yes. Yes. Just going through again. Most of the questions is about the slides. Will you please touch on deductive coding as well? So Clarissa, that's quite a good question. So if you are, for instance, following a grounded theory approach, you need to note down that within a grounded theory, that we do not follow an inductive coding process, but a deductive process. So deductive process is kind of where we already have a set theory, and we would like to test this precise theory, for example. So with regards to deductive approach, you are going to have codes already identified. Your codes are not going to be based on what the participants are saying, but your codes are going to be, for instance, already created by what you have identified based on the theory. And then you would see within the interviews, how does these codes apply? Inductive process, we would read what the participant is saying and code that, keeping in mind, for instance, our research aims and objective. But the idea behind this is to kind of see what the codes would bring as to what the participants are saying. So the focus here is just on the participants and not necessarily, for instance, having a certain coding framework and applying only that code. I hope I've answered your question. Is there a requirement for the use of research methods in qualitative research? Example, how many methods must be used or can some be included? So obviously, with regards to qualitative research methods, you are going to need to identify what is my research design. If it's a phenomenological approach, you would need to see what are the requirements for a phenomenological approach. If you are going to do, for instance, case studies, you would need to see, with regards to case studies, what are the requirements in qualitative research and what do I need to do, for instance, if that answers your question, Carol. Dandelia is asking, which part of your proposal do you describe the paradigm you are following? It all depends. Maybe you can correct me, Henny, but if I remember correctly, if it is only a dissertation for a master's, you need to add it in your literature review. You can also see, for instance, depending on your place that you are studying, might be different. If it's not, for instance, in chapter 2, based on your right underneath your literature review, you would then identify it, for instance, as a complete chapter on its own. I think that would be your paradigm would then become part of your theory and chapter 3. Double check that with your supervisor as well. Like I've mentioned, it can be different, but usually right after your literature review, you would identify your theoretical stance and your paradigm. Can the research question be left out if the problem statement is well presented, which Carol has asked? I cannot really say yes and no to this question. I can, however, say that if your aims and objectives are clearly outlined, you can maybe leave the research question out. But based on my perception, research question is very important. So please don't try and overcompensate in your objectives and aims and just leave your research question. Make sure that you have a research question. Underneath this question, you would note down the aim as to how you're going to answer this research question. After your aim, you're going to clearly identify the objectives in order to kind of see how we are going to investigate this aim. So with regards to Bote, you've mentioned for literature review research only. So if you are conducting, for instance, a systematic review, what you are going to do is you're also going to need to, for instance, identify what are your aims. Are you, for instance, looking within this literature based on, am I going to get articles based on, for instance, the methodology, or am I going to, for instance, get articles based on a certain topic that I would like to discuss? So with regards to that, you are clearly going to, first of all, identify your research aims as to what the articles are that you are trying to investigate, why you have chosen these articles. And if you have done that, then you would start also by analyzing it with the coding process. However, your codes are going to relate, for instance, as to what are the differences that you are investigating, or for instance, what are the similarities that you are investigating. So just noted with thanks, I'm doing qualitative research. Perhaps an example for students on how you relate the research question to its aims and objectives would be helpful. It's very difficult to kind of just give you an overview as all the studies. It's a bit difficult. Sorry, Clarissa, unfortunately, I do not have an example. The only thing that I kind of can note down that if you are not able to, for instance, identify your aims and objectives, go back to the SMART. Go see what are the specifics that you are measuring. How can we measure it? Is it attainable? What is the relevance? And is there any time boundedness to this, for instance, aim? All right. So I do not see any other questions. And I think we have come to I see one more question. So I will need in the TUT 101 on the checklist for proposal, it is stated that there is a comprehensive list of all sources that have been consulted. Is this only relevant for the sources used in the proposal and not the final list of all sources? So with regards to qualitative research, it's also very important to kind of note down that you are going to have a comprehensive literature review list. You're also going to need to, for instance, identify that as you do the analysis, there might be some literature currently not in your literature review. That's why qualitative is an iterative process. It means that you might even need to go back to the literature review, revise it, and maybe incorporate additional literature to kind of make sure that your stance is created. So again, with qualitative, you would engage in the proposal phase as to what literature you have identified. Within the dissertation phase, you would then furtherly explore these literatures. You would furtherly find more information. After you have done that, you would start analyzing, and you would also note, for instance, if there is any literature currently missing in the literature review. So I would like to thank everybody for attending this workshop, and I really hope it did assist you as to kind of think about what are the things that I need to consider with regard in creating a proposal in a qualitative or quantitative or mixed method perspective. If you do have any additional questions, like I've already mentioned, you can post these comments on our YouTube page, and we would be able to address these comments as well. We would also share this recording on the YouTube channel, and we will also provide, for instance, on our blog within Liminal Research, the PowerPoint presentations. And that is it from us then. Sani, I'm not sure if there's anything that you would like to say. If not, thanks for everyone. Thanks everybody.
Okay. Yeah, thank you everybody.
Thank you.
Also to mention that we will also
Thank you.
Attendance certificate to all those who have attended. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Monique. Monique, chat.
Monique,
Yes.
can I refer my M&D students to you for personal sessions on proposal writing and so on, and even the entire thesis chapter by chapter?
Yes. We do provide consultations, and these consultations can just be booked, for instance, hourly, or if they have a certain, let's say, for instance, they want their whole analysis to be and we would also be able to, for instance, quote as to say, this is the process that we follow. We assist you in the beginning, we assist you in the middle, and we assist you in the end. So definitely you can recommend your students. You can also, for instance, recommend them to...
Sorry, I've just put my email address on there, if you can. Okay, but I think on your website, perhaps maybe you do have
yes.
the rates there.
Yes, you can contact me there.
Right, Monique, thank you so much.
Thank you,
And
Carl.
Annie as well. For the first time, I've listened to quantitative research methodology, which was really interesting. Something I always wanted to do. You know, it's just a workload in terms of when you do mixed methods. It's like you said, it's basically two projects that you do in one. But anyway, have a good weekend, eh?
Thank you. Thank you, Carl.
All right, bye.
Bye. For the rest of you, if you do not have any questions, you can just leave this meeting by pressing on the leave meeting red button at the bottom. If you do still have questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Monique, if I want more information in terms of, how are you, Monique?
I'm well, thanks yourself.
Fine, thanks. Okay, if I want more information on qualitative, because it seems to I'm doing a doctorate, so it seems some part of my research are qualitative, so I'm kind of need some sources on qualitative. Because I like the way you were saying it covers part of the quality, quantity, and the quality. You can move away from the quality to quantity or quantity to quality.
Yes.
So the email which is on your website is the same email I can use.
Yes, you can.
Thanks a lot. Okay, bye. Good weekend.
Okay, bye, Norman. Cheers.
Bye, Norman.
Sorry, Annie, for putting off your video.
It seems there's not much questions left.
I don't see any questions anymore, so I'm going to end this meeting. Oh, wait, there's one question. Is it better to contact you before deciding on how to construct a questionnaire? I've never done a questionnaire. That's for you.
Yeah, definitely.
Even with the qualitative process, it's always important to kind of just get someone to consult as to see whether you have identified all the things in the beginning before even starting your data collection. Having an interview framework aligned with your research aims and objectives can be difficult. So if you maybe want to just, for instance, consult with me, I would be able to assist with that as well. Then you would be able to kind of note down whether your questionnaire is, for instance, valid and reliable, I'm not sure, before the process even starts, so that you would not, for instance, gather all your data and in the end have no analysis to do with that. So definitely, yes. Thanks, Ilse. right. So I do believe we do not have any questions anymore. So I'm going to end this meeting now, Amy. Thanks for everything.
Bye. Thank you, Monique.
Bye-bye.
Bye.